90 miles away. For the last 39 years, I owe a little bit of hakos to this community because for over 10 years, I would bring my children to learn here in the Meislis, the Katvinim and the Srivka. I would like to start with the story of Uvda, something that I witnessed myself by the Rebbe. And this is going back when I was a Bachel, in Tafshin Mem Beis, just came back from Shlichus. And my father, Olav Shalom, called me from Morocco and he told me that the head of the joint distribution, Mr. Abramovich, that usually lives in Switzerland but is going to be visiting New York, and it will be a good idea that I bring him to the Rebbe. Happens to be that Punkt, one of those days, was a Yechidus Klalis, it's already Tafshin Mem Aleph, was a Yechidus Klalis, and I asked, and they said it'll be okay if I bring him with me. I picked him up in Manhattan, and we came over, and after the Rebbe spoke, we went by the Rebbe. The Rebbe was giving dollars, and then I presented him to the Rebbe. I said, this is Mr. Abramovich, he represents the joint distribution in Africa, and that includes Morocco. The Rebbe gave him $1, gave me $1, and when we started to go down the platform, the Rebbe calls him back. The Rebbe tells him, I owe you an apology. I'm standing right there. Because you had written to me, but I did not answer. The Linedo, through the Maskiras this week, I will answer. We go down, he turns to me and he says, I never wrote to the Rebbe. I tell him the Rebbe doesn't make mistakes. The Rebbe said he wrote, so he wrote. And we had this back and forth, and by the end he says to me, he says, you guys are brainwashed? Okay, so let's talk about something else. We go down Kingston Avenue. Those that remember, there used to be payphones. So as we come to the corner of President and Kingston, he says he needs to call his wife in Switzerland. I went to the side to give him some privacy. And he's talking to his wife, and all of a sudden, come over. He tells me his wife reminded him, because he told her the story, what just happened. His wife reminded him that 20 years ago, he wrote to the Rebbe. And I guess he had forgotten. But the Rebbe didn't forget exactly the Rebbe's cheshbonos, that I had to see him, or whatever. It took 20 years, that's not our thing. But I didn't want to turn to him and ask him, no, what about this brainwashing? So that's something that right there, and this is a story that I'll remember. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Yontif today, Hey Tavis. I want to concentrate about the idea of having gaguing to the Rebbe. When we have these feelings of yearning about the Rebbe. Because this is what it's all about. Hey Tavis has many different things that happen. Hey Tavis, there's Farim, there's the court case and all the things. At first, I want to concentrate on what was seen on the Chassidim part. I remember getting the phone call, if I remember correct, it was my brother Herschel that called me. He says, דידן Notzach. And I just went into the car and drove from Burlington to New York. And joined everyone there in the dancing, stayed there for almost a whole week, till I could say the Rebbe almost sent us all back after the Sikha Yipres Tavis. But that feeling that whoever was there, that feeling that we all felt, bursting out when we witnessed the pain and the suffering that the Rebbe went through. And all of a sudden, there was a Didan Notzach. This was a burst out. And that, when you saw the Ave, the love of the Chassidim to the Rebbe. And that's something that, in a way, to relive that, and to be able to give that feeling to our children, to our grandchildren, that by itself is something very powerful. There's a Sikha from the Rebbe in Vayigash, Tinaseh, where he talks about Vayigash, and he says this big sparsha. And he says there's three matzavim, three situations in Vayigash. He says there's a situation, what Yehuda taught to himself then, that he's speaking to the viceroy, he's speaking to Yosef. And then there is, the Rebbe says, the second situation is, the second matzav is the real matzav, the matzav ha'amiti, that Yosef is Yosef HaTzadik. And that's who Yehuda is facing. And then there is the third matzav, Beruchnis V'inyanim, the whole idea of Smichas Gula L'Tfila, that Yosef is Geula and Tfila is Yehuda, and the connection between the two of them. So in many situations, wherever we find ourselves, wherever we talk about Hey Tavis, there's so many different levels that you could talk about. Till the Hira B'Pearl Mamish, that you need to go and buy a sefer. But when you look a little bit deeper, there's a situation, what the Rebbe spoke the months before and what went on. But then there's this point I'm trying to bring out is when the Gaguim, when all of a sudden this love to the Rebbe burst out in the open. And I was thinking a little bit, being a Bacher, a little bit earlier in September in the Lameds, there was a few times that feeling existed. And going back to Tafshin Lamed Ches, after the story of Shmini Atzeres, and when the Rebbe is in his room, and what went on the day of Shmini Atzeres, I remember like today, I was a young Bachel in all the Torah, and they told everyone to go home the night of Shmini Atzeres. But a few of us stayed. I stayed. And I remember, like, this is something I won't forget. It was 5:30 in the morning, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, when all of a sudden, we didn't hear it clear, but there was this birching, the murmuring, something is going on, something is not okay. Later we found out that it was not such a good situation. And seeing some of the Bachrim, the older Bachrim, sitting, Mizoktilim, Umiveint, and all this is contained for the next month. And then came Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and I remember sitting in Olateira, we were in the kitchen, around 7 o'clock, and then about 7:30 we got a phone call, the Rebbe is going home. And we ran like crazy, we ran to 770. And the Rebbe coming out, going home. And a few minutes later, after the Rebbe left, the simcha that burst out. It all came from these gaguim, this yearning, thinking about the Rebbe, and that special love to the Rebbe that it's hard to describe. A few years later, quite a few laters after Chav Zayin Adar Tafshin Beis, and for months when we didn't see the Rebbe, and I remember when the phone call came that the Rebbe is coming out, and that it was coming out of the porch. That wanting to go, to figure out, and the waiting, is the Rebbe going to come out today? Is the Rebbe going to come out tomorrow? these hergation and vayomim ha'ela niskam b'naisim. And I remember going back to Tov Shema Ches, Matzei Simchas Torah. I knew that I need to call my father in Morocco and tell him what happened. And I knew that's not going to be an easy phone call. I remember calling my father, and the first thing I told him, I started to tell him, Baruch Hashem, als is jetzt kuktuis beseder, aber, and before he even had a chance to say something, and you know, this is when we were just talking on the phone, he burst out crying that I never heard him crying this way. I have to tell you, I didn't even hear him crying that way when he found out his father passed away. That kind of, all of a sudden it hit me. And these are the kind of allegation that we, my siblings, we grew up in a house. That kind of a love to the Rebbe, that the Rebbe is, it's not just our father. This is it. And that kind of a love, in a way, when it comes a day like today, like Hey Tavis, Vayomim ha'ela niskam b'naisim, this is what we have to kind of work on ourselves, and it's not easy, and how to remember those days, give it over to our children and to our grandchildren, and to talk about this idea of his kashas, because that's what it is. Hanasi hu ha'koil, the Rebbe, this is everything for us. It reminds me of a very interesting story, because I asked my father about this. Today, Baruch Hashem, in Morocco, is almost peaceful times. Everyone travels to Morocco now. Mamish became a safe haven. Many Yidden, there's tours, trips all the time. I know from a lot of Yidden here in Montreal that they had traveled to Morocco. But in the early days, it wasn't so simple in Morocco. To walk by yourself in the streets as a Yid, with your yarmulke, with your tzitzis, many, many times we had our yarmulke grabbed or punched. I remember coming back, we came back from New York one time, it was of test maybe, and I was so excited because I saw in New York everyone is driving the bikes, there's nothing what to be afraid of. And in Casablanca, where we lived, you have to be very careful, especially in those times. So we had a long hallway in our house, and that's where you practice biking back and forth. Unless when you go out with my mother sometimes. And I remember how I was, one time, especially then coming back from New York, I told my mother, it's New York over here, there's nothing what to be afraid. And I took my bike and I went on my own. It didn't take long. I would say 5 zhlubs came and they threw me off the bike and gave it to me I remember not to go back on not to go on myself. Well, the point I wanted to bring out is, this is the story. We live in an apartment house that happens to be that my mother is still there. And on the top floor, there was a family from Fez. We call them the Fassis. Usually the people of Fez were known as more fundamentalist, a lot of so-called Hamas. So I remember coming back from yeshiva. This is Tov Shema Medalef, 1971. There's a break, 12 to 2. The way it's in Europe, we come home. I come up the steps, and this little kid, this Fassi kid, He's standing on the top floor, and he's aiming his spits on top of me. It was Gishmei Bracha coming down. I go into the house, we're on the second floor, and I tell my mother, because we already knew when this happens, I tell her, did anything happen in Israel today? We go, we open the shortwaves, because the local media you can't trust, then. And yes, last night, Israel invaded Beirut, killed the terrorists in their beds. So here is the response, in Morocco. You're coming up the steps and you're getting the rain on top of you. Okay. My father comes home, and my mother tells him what has just happened. He didn't ask any questions. He's running out of the house. And I remember my mother screaming, "Who lives to? Where are you going?" He ran upstairs, walked into their house, went into their dining room. He started to bang on the table. "Who started up with my children? You should know I am respected by the king. I am respected by the governor. I will go and report to them what you guys have done." And I'm thinking, what exactly is he doing? What exactly going to happen over here? And you should see how they start to beg him. "Please don't call the king. Please don't call the governor." And that was the last time that we got Gishmei Bracha. I've asked my father, "What is that? Will you take the guts to do such a thing?" He says, "I'm a shliach of the Rebbe, and that's what it is. And when you go with the Rebbe's keiches,